Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, delegates at Cameroon's ill-fated national dialogue aimed at ending the Anglophone crisis almost come to blows. Opposition participants accused the government of putting the event on just for show. Also, Somali weavers are trying to preserve the use of local fabrics and the wearing of traditional outfits, even though their business is under threat by imports of inexpensive clothes from China, Europe and the US. We take a closer look. And Harry and Meghan head home. The British royal couple wrap up their 10-day tour of the continent, pledging millions in support to jobless young South Africans. But first, Cameroon's attempt at national dialogue aimed at ending 3 years of conflict around an Anglophone crisis has faltered further. On Wednesday, delegates reportedly almost came to blows at the government-organised talks. Many opposition figures have stayed away or walked out after having dismissed the 5-day meeting as a farce. Thousands of people have been killed and 500,000 forced from their homes since unrest first erupted in 2016 over calls for more English to be used in schools. That later escalated into a brutal armed secessionist conflict between soldiers and separatist militia. Max Bone joins us now with more. Max, thanks very much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, you've also spoken to several participants at that national dialogue in Yaoundé. What are they telling you about why things descended as far as they did on Wednesday?
Well, prior to the dialogue commencing, right after it was announced, many were under the impression that this was not a genuine attempt to actually resolve the Anglophone crisis, and that, in fact, it would be a monologue within the ruling elite, and in particular, President Paul Biya's CPDM party. And what happened today demonstrates that, unfortunately, that fear appears to be coming true. Many walked out because they claimed that only CPDM members were being given the opportunity to speak, and also the commission that is focusing on decentralization has claimed that the form of state is not up for discussion, which in effect means that the government is keeping their ground on claiming that under no circumstances will there be a return to federation. So unfortunately, many feel that the fears that have led to some not participating in the dialogue are coming true, and that it's not a genuine attempt to resolve the crisis.
So the talks never started off on a particularly good foot, but despite that, despite those who turned their backs on the dialogue, do you think that there is still much of a chance of it achieving anything much at all?
Unfortunately, no, because prior to the talks, many said, well, we are not going to participate because this is not genuine. And those who did participate did so believing that there might have been some event that has led the government to change its overall position. And the events of the past few days have made clear that under no circumstances is the government going to change its position. And furthermore, the secessionists, who are the ones fighting for an independent state by the name of Ambazonia, are not participating in the dialogue. So, no, unfortunately, there's really no way that this could do anything to resolve the crisis under the current circumstances.
Now, both sides, both the secessionist militia and the soldiers, state soldiers, have been accused of committing horrible atrocities since the conflict escalated into violence in about 2017. But do you think that the onus to resolve this lies any more with one side than the other?
Well, it's imperative to go back to 2017 when this crisis started. And the fact is that this crisis started when the government violently clamped down on peaceful demonstrators. So therefore, it is clear that the onus is on the government. While the secessionists have committed many human rights abuses themselves and have also refused to enter into some forms of dialogue with the government, particularly informal dialogue or track to diplomacy, it is clear that the onus is on the government, both due to the decades of marginalization, the denial of burning down villages and other human rights abuses, and the basic fact that it is the actions of this government, the government of Paul Biya, that has led to this crisis breaking out. So unless the government changes its position, which they have not yet, unfortunately, there's no way that this crisis can be resolved.
Thanks very much, Max Bone there. Well, in other news, hundreds of angry family members of soldiers demonstrated outside a military camp in Bamako on Wednesday, accusing the government of having played down a fatal jihadist raid in which it says 25 troops were killed on Monday. Scores of soldiers are still missing after militants used heavy armed vehicles to raid two camps in Bukesi and Mondoro near the border with Burkina Faso. Nigeria's president has flown out to South Africa for a state visit. Muhammadu Buhari will meet his counterpart Cyril Ramaphosa on Thursday to discuss boosting trade ties. Now, this trip was planned before a wave of xenophobic attacks broke out in Johannesburg, in which Nigerian businesses were often targeted. The violence, in which at least 12 people were killed, none of whom were Nigerian, sparked fury in Nigeria and saw hundreds of migrant workers repatriated to the country. And the US says that it's reopened its embassy in Somalia 3 decades after it was shut. Despite al-Shabaab bombing attacks this week that targeted a convoy of Italian advisors in Mogadishu and an American army base in Balidogle, Washington says that it believes that Somalia has made progress in the face of security threats. The US military says that it's carried out 54 airstrikes against al-Shabaab extremist cells in Somalia this year. Well, staying with Somalia, weavers there are trying to preserve the use of local fabrics and the use of traditional outfits. Their business, though, is under threat by imports of inexpensive clothing and textiles from China, Europe and the US. Nicholas Chamat tells us more.
Some Somalis worry that these weavers of the country's traditional fabric, known as al-Hindi, could be the last of their kind. The influx of cheaper textiles, new and second-hand, from Europe, China and the US, means their livelihoods are under threat.
I've been doing this job for 40 years. I earn just $2 a day. It's not enough. I have bills for my family, and if one of my kids were to get sick, I could not buy medicine for them. But I don't know any other profession.
Analysts say textile industries all over East Africa have ground to a halt over the last 30 years because of cheap imports. Some customers try to defend the local traditions.
I buy these clothes to promote local production and encourage them to make more clothes. I've spent about $29 for 4 pieces.
Traditional weavers are also supported by some shop owners.
These clothes are much better than the imported clothes. Their quality is superior since they were woven by hand. The market isn't good these days. I'll keep marketing traditional clothes and also telling people that they're not expensive.
Some countries like Rwanda recently raised import tariffs on used clothing. But several others like Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda, who had initially pledged to do the same, later backed down after receiving threats of retaliation by the Trump administration.
Now, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex pledged to give £8 million of support to skills training for unemployed young people in South Africa as the royal couple wrapped up their 10-day tour of Africa on Wednesday. Harry and Meghan met with President Cyril Ramaphosa and Graça Machel, the widow of the country's first democratically elected president, Nelson Mandela. Baby Archie was also along for the ride on the family's first official tour since his birth. Harry, during the 10 days, also visited Botswana, Malawi and Angola and has said that he feels a connection to the continent. Well, as they head home, Jane Flanagan joins us now with more for a look back at their trip. Jane, was it much of a success?
Well, Georgia, you may recall that the Duke and Duchess were suffering something of a tricky PR period when they embarked on their tour of Southern Africa. So this tour was really seen as an opportunity for them to show their best selves. And I think to a large extent, they pulled that off. It was very low key. There were no big fashions, no big parties, all the sort of celebrity excess, which had earned them some very bad press in recent months, were cast aside, and they really got down and down to basics and going to townships and visiting schools and really meeting a lot of ordinary South Africans, not celebrities, but some of the more famous people in South Africa as well, people like Desmond Tutu and so on. So I think it was very much what they wanted to get out of it. Unfortunately, yesterday, Prince Harry put out a rather stinging statement, quite unprecedented actually, in which he accused the British media of bullying his wife and likening her treatment to the way in which his mother, the late Princess Diana, was treated in the years leading up to her death in the late 90s. And that has rather overshadowed the trip, unfortunately. So I think that in the years to come, when people remember this tour, it perhaps won't be for the good work that they did while they were here, but rather for how it ended, which was on a slightly sour note.
Well, so it looks like they generally may have come out of this looking pretty good, but from the perspective of the African the African perspective on this, do you feel that Africans particularly cared about their presence on the continent, particularly in light of how much is often made about Meghan Markle's mixed race heritage?
Well, of course, in South Africa, we don't have the equivalent of Meghan and Harry. There is no royal family, and there isn't the obsession with celebrity and the celebrity culture that we see in large parts of Europe and North America. And so I think there was a sense of occasion, of course, around many of their visits. You know, crowds gathered, they arrived in some very smart cars and waved. And there was a sense of expectation around these people, and they were important in some way. But I'm not quite sure there were many people in South Africa and the other countries that Harry visited who really had an appreciation how big they are back at home. I mean, Africans really are very preoccupied with living day to day, dealing with the deepening inequality and the poverty and rising levels of unemployment and so on, especially here in South Africa. So I think looking back, this will have been a trip that was much more important to the British royal family than it probably was to many of the African states who were visited.
Thanks very much. Jane Flanagan there for us in Cape Town. Well, that's it for Eye on Africa for now. Thanks for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.
From North to South Africa, from Bamako to Nairobi, from Accra to Mogadishu. Bringing you all the political, economic, cultural and social news from Africa for a better insight into an ever-changing continent.
Across Africa, presented by Georgia Calvin-Smith on France 24 and France24.com.